Two brothers named Adam and Hoss Cartwright played on Bonanza. They were very different from each other. Adam, the smart and well-educated engineer, and Hoss, the kind and gentle giant. Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker, who played them, were just as different behind the scenes. Pernell was known for talking out against the show, and he often had problems with the people who made it and his co-stars. At the same time, Dan, who loved his part as Hoss but hated the attention it brought, went away from Hollywood to find peace. After Blocker's sudden death at age 43, their paths became even more different. While fans were sad, Roberts made an unexpected choice. He didn't show up to the funeral. Why did he stay away? Was it anger, sadness, or something deeper? As you may know, Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker were big stars on Bonanza, but their lives were full of twists, turns, and interesting roads that made them who they are today. Sometimes it's hard to believe how different their early years were. In spite of that, fate brought them together on one of the most famous TV shows ever. Let me take you back to the start of everything. Pernell Roberts, who would later become Adam Cartwright, really loved being on stage. He first got a lot of attention when he went on stage at the Olney Theater in Maryland in 1949. Picture him as a young man with big plans. She was in The Man Who Came to Dinner with Moss Hart and Kitty Carlisle. Even though it was only the beginning, he was already bright. That was the last time Pernell stopped. He was many things, like Dan in Night, Must Fall, and Alfred Doolittle in Pygmalion. He was skilled and could do a lot of different things. You could tell he was destined for great things. It was 1952, and Pernell was ready to go after even bigger goals. He packed his things and went to New York City. He's now a big star. When it came to making it in theater in the 1950s, New York was the place to be, and Pernell didn't wait to get involved. He did work off-Broadway in Shakespearean plays and one-act shows. It's easy to picture him as Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet, or as Macbeth walking across the stage. For that role, he even got a Drama Desk Award in 1955. Not an easy task. His time with the American Shakespeare Festival made him love classical parts even more. He wasn't afraid to try new things, though. He was in many plays, from Twelfth Night to The Merchant of Venice, and he always gave the roles his own style. A lot of the time, TV calls, and Pernell's first show was on Kraft Television Theater in 1956. He might have been on shows like Whirlybirds or Cheyenne back then if you were alive. People were getting used to seeing him, but the stage was still his heart. He kept working in movies, TV, and the theater even after signing a deal with Columbia Pictures in 1957. Desire Under the Elms, which came out in 1958, was one of his first movie roles. He played one of Burl Ives' kids. People noticed that Pernell was good at playing figures with a lot of depth. While this was going on, Dan Blocker was on his own in a very different world. Dan's rise to fame wasn't as smooth as Pernell's. He was big. He was very hard to miss, but he was a good person. In his life before Hollywood, Dan served in the Army during the Korean War. It must not have been easy for him to be an Army sergeant. He fought in battle and got a Purple Heart for his bravery. He must have become stronger and nicer because of those events, which you can see in his work as Hoss Cartwright. Dan went back to normal life after the war and started trying his hand at acting. A Three Stooges short film called Outer Space Jitters came out in 1957, and he was in it. It's funny to picture him in that part, isn't it? There was no doubt that Dan was funny and not afraid to play odd roles. He showed up in Gunsmoke, Cheyenne, and even the Rifleman shows. One of his early parts that stood out was as a rodeo performer in Richard Diamond, Private Detective. He played many roles, such as blacksmiths, waiters, and cowboys, and slowly became known as a reliable character performer. Meanwhile, Pernell and Dan were heading straight for each other without realizing it. Pernell was a well-known and respected actor by the late 1950s. He had parts in Broadway shows, TV shows, and movies alternating between lead and supporting roles. Dan, on the other hand, was making a name for himself in westerns. He was tough, which was great for the genre, but he was also warm, which made him stand out. Both men had important events in their lives in 1959 that would soon bring them both to the same place. In the movie Ride Lonesome, which starred Randolph Scott, Pernell played a complicated criminal. Many reviewers said it was one of the best parts he had ever played. It showed how well he could give even the most basic figures depth. At about the same time, Dan played an unhappy rancher in the pilot episode of The Rebel. It wasn't a big deal. In it, he showed how he could make tough, larger-than-life characters seem vulnerable. After that came Bonanza. David Dortort, who made the show, was casting a family story that would take place in the Wild West. It was important to him that the players brought something new to the Cartwright family. Strong characters that would make them stand out on their own and also help them work together. Was an obvious fit for Adam Cartwright, the oldest son. He seemed in charge, and his quiet determination made you think he could handle himself on a huge ranch. On the other hand, Dan was cast as Hoss, the kind giant with a good heart. Dortort saw something unique and special in Dan that had nothing to do with his size. Dan was the right choice for Hoss because he was likable and someone people would root for. He seems like he was born to play the part. The puzzle pieces began to fit together right away. Two very different men, Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker, were about to make history on TV when they walked onto the set of Bonanza. Their jobs and lives were about to change forever, but they had no idea it. When Bonanza first came out in 1959, it stood out right away. The Western wasn't like most of them. It wasn't just gunfights, bad guys, and dirty saloons. The beautiful Nevada wilderness was the setting for Bonanza's stories about family, morals, and doing what's right. What made the Cartwright family, who were at the show's center, unique? Like strong people, they were kind and always did the right thing, even when it was hard. Even though Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker were a big part of that family, their time on the show wasn't always easy. The oldest kid. Adam was smarter, more educated, and full of thoughts than his brothers. As a building engineer, his character was often the smart one in the family who could figure out what was wrong. Adam was played by Pernell with the right amount of gravity for the part. But as the show went on, Pernell began to feel limited by the character and the show itself. He had worked in theater before, where each part was new and exciting. It didn't make him happy to play Adam every week in the same outfit and setting. Pernell wasn't afraid to talk about how upset he was. He often said the show was junk TV and said it didn't have enough meaning. It seemed like the stories were too easy and didn't deal with important problems like racism or social justice. He joked that being on Bonanza was like Isaac Stern sitting in with Lawrence Welk. That's how much he didn't want to be a part of something he thought was beneath him. Not only did Pernell dislike the writing, though. He didn't like how his character, a man in his 30s, always had to ask Lorne Greene's character, Ben Cartwright, for permission to do things. He said in interviews that the connection was like a kid's, and that it didn't make sense for three grown men to depend on their dad for everything. That made him sad because he thought his part wasn't getting bigger. He wanted stories that had more depth and problems, more chances to play, and more chances to improve his skills. Even though Pernell had trouble with Bonanza's direction, Dan Blocker loved playing Hoss Cartwright. Hoss was the show's heart. He was a big, friendly guy with a good heart. It's hard to picture anyone else playing Hoss because Dan made the role so warm and funny. The role was based on a friend from youth who was tough on the outside but kind on the inside, and it worked great. Dan also brought his own ideas to the job. He once said that when he played Hoss, he thought of the words, "We shall pass this way on earth but once. If there is any kindness we can show, let us do it now in every scene." That kindness shone through. Hoss helped people he didn't know, fought for the weak, and showed the kinder side of the Cartwrights. His fans and co-stars both loved it. But things on set didn't always go well. In 1962, when they were making an episode called The Dowry, Pernell and Dan were in a very scary crash. As they rode their horses down a muddy road, Pernell's horse slipped and fell. Dan was right behind them and couldn't escape the mess, so he too fell down. Even though both guys tried to jump clear, they were hurt. Dan broke his collarbone and sprained his neck, and Pernell hurt his neck. So Dan could keep shooting with his arm in a sling. The scripts had to be changed. The accident did more than just hurt people. As for Pernell, it looked like another reason to leave the show. He was already upset, and now he had to deal with getting hurt. Some people even thought that the crash was the last straw for him. There were a few more seasons of him on Bonanza, but it was clear that he no longer cared about the show. Behind the scenes, the group had a lot of problems. Because Pernell spoke his mind, he often had problems with the directors and writers. He was always brave enough to say what he thought, even if it meant upsetting people. Dan, on the other hand, was more chill and got along with everyone. He was a favorite on set because he was funny and had a big personality. The two stars respected each other even though they were different. There was no doubt that they were good friends, but they worked well together and made their roles real in a way that people could relate to. Pernell's anger at the show grew, but Dan found other things to do with his energy. He was in a few movies, such as Come Blow Your Horn with Frank Sinatra, and even helped open a chain of Bonanza steakhouse chains. He used his fame as ha-has to push the company by being in commercials and going to see franchisees in person. It was a smart move that showed how much he loved his Bonanza part. Even though Pernell didn't always agree with the show's views, it wasn't afraid to deal with important problems. At the time, episodes like Enter Thomas Bowers were the first to deal with racism in a new way. In that story, Hoss helps keep an African-American opera singer safe in Virginia City from racist people. The Cartwright family stood up for what was right in that powerful episode. Other shows, like The Wish and The Fear Merchants, also talked about racism and inequality, slowly going beyond what a Western could do. Pernell thought the show could have done more, though. He wanted stories with more depth and more powerful themes. It was 1965 before he gave up.